Hello, everybody, and welcome to tonight's event, Climate Change, Is There Any Hope?, which is part of the 2023 Imagine Belfast Festival of Ideas and Politics. My name's Adam McGibbon, and I'm the moderator for this evening. I'm a climate activist and a campaign strategist from Belfast originally, and I've been working on climate change, housing justice, union organising for about 16 years now. Now, the title of tonight's event, Is There Any Hope?, I hope it isn't too much of a spoiler to say that there is hope when it comes to climate change, and that's what we're going to discuss tonight. But me saying that there is hope doesn't mean that you get to switch off now, nor does it mean that you get to walk away and think, okay, climate change will be fine, somebody else will sort it out. And the reason for that is because hope only gives us the ability to act. It doesn't necessarily mean things will turn out a certain way. The point is that hope is not just a noun, but it's a verb too. And I don't think anybody says this better than the writer Rebecca Solnit, who writes that hope isn't a lottery ticket that you clutch and feel lucky. Hope is an axe that you break down doors with in an emergency. Hope should shove you out the door. Now, that quote is from her book, Hope in the Dark, a short and fantastic book that I turn to when I'm feeling despair at the climate crisis and the crises all around us. Because ultimately, even the most optimistic of us, when faced with the enormity of the crisis, will sometimes feel demotivated or feel despair. And how could you not feel like that? That's the way I felt when I saw Trump get elected in America in 2016, when I saw Bolsonaro getting elected in Brazil, when you live through an abnormally warm summer like we had here in the UK last year, or even like yesterday when the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change released yet another bleak scientific assessment on the state of the world. But ultimately, despair is demotivating. And if we can find reasons for hope, then we find reasons to be motivated. When I'm feeling down, I get hope from seeing the increasing numbers of people all over the world who are taking brave stands against fossil fuel projects in the courts and work, in the corridors of power, in the streets. I get hope by thinking that everyone who's watching this, we are all the humans that happen to be alive during what's perhaps the most pivotal moment in human history. So we've all got that responsibility to do something, and there are millions of people rising to that occasion. And I take hope from knowing that although some global warming is already locked into the climate system, we do have control over what happens next, what happens beyond this point. Every fraction of a degree Celsius warming that we can prevent is going to save millions of lives. So there isn't anything more important, and there isn't anything else that we should be doing with so much potential to save lives. So that's the sort of thing that keeps me going. And tonight you're going to be hearing about what motivates and inspires our three panelists, but also crucially, and you're going to hear this throughout the whole talk, you're going to get ideas and inspiration to put some of that hope into practice and to build your own hope through action. So we've got a fantastic panel of speakers tonight to talk on this subject. So I'm going to introduce them all now. First speaker is Kendra Pierre-Louis. Kendra is a climate journalist. She empowers others to take meaningful climate action individually and collectively through her podcast, How to Save a Planet. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, Popular Science, among others. And she's also the author of the book Greenwashed, Why We Can't Buy Our Way to a Green Planet. Jacqueline Gill is an associate professor of paleoecology and plant ecology at the University of Maine. She has written extensively on climate hope, and in fact, she actually has a chapter in a forthcoming book edited by Rebecca Solnit and Thelma Young, Not Too Late, which is about this very topic of being hopeful at a time of climate change. And finally, Asad Razouk is a clean energy entrepreneur, author, and broadcaster. He co-founded and runs a clean energy company financing, building, and operating renewable energy projects in Asia. And he is also the author of the book, Saving the Climate Without the Bullshit. He is a board member of Client Earth, the environmental charity using the power of the law to protect people and planet. So, ladies and gentlemen, that's your panel tonight. We're going to hear from each of the speakers in turn. And then after we've heard from all three of the speakers, it's over to yourselves for a Q&A. So first up is Kendra. So I'll turn it over to Kendra now.
Hi, Adam. Thanks so much for having me today. And since I think you started by talking about hope and motivation. I feel like my role is to demotivate everyone right out the gate. No, I'm kidding. But yeah, I am a climate reporter. Actually, my podcast, or the podcast I worked on, How to Save a Planet, was actually canceled in October. So I'm in between gigs. I started a new gig, yay, in 2 weeks. But I feel like in the 2.5 years that I worked for How to Save a Planet, we learned a lot about climate reporting and how to tell climate stories differently. And before I get into that, what I want to say is that like the slide that's on the screen is Bloom My Beat is a joke because climate change, people sort of automatically assume it's depressing. And so I'm going to try my best to not be too depressing today. And what I want to do is I want to dive into sort of how climate storytelling is typically done and how I think we can do it better. And what I think we emphasize too much as climate journalists, and ways that I think we can make climate reporting more engaging and something people can better connect to. And to do that, I'm going to start a little bit with who I am as a reporter, and then talk a little bit about how climate change reporting is typically done, and then explain a little bit how to Save a Planet did things differently. And so to start, this is me drinking from the Greenland ice sheet, which maybe Jacqueline's actually been to. And I feel like this is sort of what people think of when they think of climate reporters. They get to fly around the world and see sort of the worst things that happen to climate change, and that's like sometimes true. Lots of times you end up in far less exciting places like Duluth. I've been to Boise like 5 times at this point. Lovely city, but generally not what people are thinking about when they think of climate reporting. And I share this because that's what people think of when they think of climate reporting. And that is some of what I do, but I feel like a lot of what I do is more represented by something like this, which everybody has seen at this point. And I love showing this chart whenever I give presentations, because I often give presentations to college students, to younger people. And the thing that, like, you can look at this chart and you can see, oh yeah, you can see that the planet has gotten warmer, and that is a story. But the story that I usually like to tell people when I show this chart is, if you are born after 1976, you have never known a normal temperature year. And that usually hits differently. You've never known an unusually cool temperature year. And I like telling people that, because that's what I think in many ways a journalist's role is to do, is not just to give people information, but to contextualize it. And I think what we've done as an industry sort of over the past 10 years is the way we've contextualized it has always been to lead with fear. And so I'm going to give you kind of a quick rundown of sort of like, I don't know, the 5 or 6 buckets that I think climate change stories typically fall into. The first is longer, more catastrophic fires. We love telling fire stories. I think partly because they're so visually stunning. I know that's really grim to say, but I think it's true. One of the biggest issues with climate change is that in many ways it's invisible, right? Like CO2, you can't see it with the naked eye, but you can see the impacts, and some impacts are more telegenic than others. And climate change is one of them, or fires are one of them. Another one that we like to tell a lot are floods, and both because they're really catastrophic, but also because it's the same thing. It's really easy to envision. We tell drought stories a little bit less, I think. They have to get pretty catastrophic, in part because it's harder to see. And oftentimes, this is even grim to say, but like the places that drought hurts the most are often poorer places that don't get enough coverage in the first place from the global north. And so we don't tell them as much, but still when we do, it's like these like really sad images, like that those are dead animals in the background. And the other is bleached coral reefs, which is for a while I had a no coral reef story, because I felt like so many people have never even seen a coral reef. So it's like this weird story that you're telling people about an ecosystem that they don't really understand. But we tell these stories all of the time. I mean, I feel like everyone in the audience has probably heard the story, and definitely everyone in the panel has heard some version of the dying coral reef story a million times. Hurricanes, we're getting ready for hurricane season. And then lastly, sort of what I'd led the image with, which is melting glaciers. And so now that I've run through that really quickly, the question that I have for you is, how are you feeling? Right? Probably like this, not great. And it's just, I mean, I feel it too. I want to be clear. I don't think that these stories are bad. I don't think that these stories are unimportant. It's important that we chronicle that the changes the planet is undergoing because of climate change. But I think there's problems with just telling these stories. And I want to be clear, like I've done it. I've made these mistakes. I've done every single one. I've done every single one of these types of stories. I will continue to do these kinds of stories. When there's a hurricane, it's important to report on that hurricane because it impacts a lot of people and to explain the links to climate change. But when you take a step back and look at the sweep of climate stories, what you notice is what these things are missing and that there's other ways to tell stories. And to show you how to tell these stories, I'm going to begin with showing, not telling. I'm going to play a clip from the podcast that I used to work on, How to Save a Planet. It's about 4 minutes long.
So the students started formulating their statements to present at the supervisors' meeting. They wrote pretty typical environmental arguments, like how the project would impact habitat and water resources along the highway, Exxon's contributions to climate change, that sort of thing.
Which sounds like it was winding up to be, a pretty typical jobs versus environment fight. The students were saying, think about the environment. The pro-Exxon folks, I'm assuming, were saying that if we truck this oil, it'll bring jobs and economic benefits.
It could have shaped up to be an argument like that. But the students decided to include another argument, one they learned from our episode, The Shareholders versus Exxon. In that episode, Larry Fink, the CEO of BlackRock, the largest asset management firm in the world, said climate change is bad for the business of companies like Exxon. Here's Fink.
I'm doing this not as an environmentalist. I'm doing this as a capitalist who truly believes that climate change is investment risk. Many companies are ill prepared for this.
So the EAB decided to do something you don't usually see student activists do, which is lean into the argument of a billionaire CEO,
Larry Fink,
and use that as part of their statements at the Board of Supervisors meeting.
Good morning. Welcome. I'll call to order the March 8th, 2022 meeting of the Santa Barbara County Board of Supervisors here in the Santa
After
Maria
months of
County
outreach
room.
to local officials, including speaking before the County Planning Commission, which recommended denying Exxon for safety reasons, the EAB logged into the Zoom for the Board of Supervisors meeting where a final decision was going to be made. When the EAB students got their turn on the mic, they presented their arguments against the Exxon plan, citing climate change, damage to the local ecosystem, and quoting from BlackRock CEO Larry Fink.
In 2021, BlackRock, the world's largest asset management firm, stated the following: Exxon must further assess its strategy. The company's current reluctance to do so has the potential to undermine its long-term financial sustainability. If even the world's largest asset manager doubts Exxon viability, then why should we trust it with our jobs? Supervisors, Exxon will not create and sustain the jobs it claims. I urge you to deny the Exxon trucking proposal. Thank you.
After more public comment from members of the community, from Exxon corporate, from tons of environmental activist groups, it was time for the supervisors to make their statements and vote. And as they voted, one of the supervisors directly referenced what the EAB said about BlackRock in his comment.
One of the world's largest financial asset managers, BlackRock, stated last year that ExxonMobil should further assess its strategy and board expertise against the possibility that demand for fossil fuels may decline rapidly in the coming decades. I will be voting to deny this application because I cannot make the finding.
The Board of Supervisors as a whole voted 3-2 to deny Exxon's proposal, meaning Exxon won't be trucking their oil through these areas, and they won't be able to drill oil at these platforms for the foreseeable future. When the students reached out to thank the supervisors afterwards, they got a response from the supervisor who they weren't sure would end up voting in their direction. The supervisor said, quote, EAB letter and testimony showed that the claimed benefits were much more speculative than claimed. We just followed your evidence, end quote. Jesse, another one of the students that we talked to, believes that being able to make that economic argument was really important in getting those votes.
They kind of cheated us more naively and like children, oh, save the salamanders, oh, we need to save these foxes. So at that moment, I think is when it became less of them looking at us as naive students and realize that, oh, they've actually connected the dots and they realize that there's a different argument that they need to make.
So this was from an episode we did about 2 years into our run, because we'd been doing 2 years of solution journalism, and we wanted to ask our listeners, like, what have you been doing? Because at the end of every episode, every episode would sort of lay out a problem related to climate change, lay out people or solutions that were working on it, and then at the end there would be a call to action. And we wanted to know, after 2 years, like, had anyone done anything? And this is one of the groups that reached out to us and was like, hey, based on your podcast, we learned X, Y, and Z. We used it and we helped block this Exxon project. We had no idea when we were doing this episode about climate finance that this is how that information would be used. But the kind of this full suite of how we put things together helped listeners understand how they can get engaged. We've had people introduce legislation. We had someone save their local recycling program. Someone actually ran for public office. And because we're focused on solutions, that meant people actually looked forward to listening to our episodes. They felt less alone and less like they had to go it alone, and more empowered to do things and connect with others. And so, sort of broadly, what we found in 2.5 years of doing the show is that we broke climate change into digestible bits so people can understand it. We identified a problem within climate change, so drought, agriculture, transportation, electric generation. And then we found someone working, or people working on a solution, and then we talked to them. None of this is really rocket science. I can also say that as a climate journalist, it was also way more fun to do because, one episode I got to talk to a shepherd who was grazing sheep under solar panels, which help eases the tension between using farmland and solar land for farmland for solar generation, and I got to shove a mic into a sheep, and that was great. Like, you live for things like that. And I don't want to take up too much of your time, but one of the last big episodes I worked on was sort of about bicycling. And so often when we talk about bicycling, it's like, eat your medicine. Like, you need to bike because it's better for the planet. And I had this revelation that the reason I ride a bike is because it's fun. And that kind of always gets left out of the conversation. So I did a whole episode about why biking is fun. I interviewed adults who are learning how to ride a bike for the first time. And if you want to hear kid-like joy, find a group of adults learning to ride a bike for the first time. And then I got our engineer, and this I think is a good send off to Jacqueline, to make us a jingle. And that's what I want to play for you now.
It's fun to move, powered by you and not through fossil fuels. Ride down some stairs, park anywhere. That's the beauty of biking. Fun, clean, healthy. That's the beauty of cycling. Accessible physical mountains and roads. That's the beauty of biking. It's fun, clean, healthy. That's the beauty of cycling. Accessible physical mountains and roads. That's the beauty of biking. It's fun to move, powered by you and not through fossil fuels. Ride down some stairs, park anywhere. That's the beauty of biking.
I apologize in advance that it's going to get stuck in your head. And there is actually a bike shop in Albany that made it their hold music. So you never know how you can have impact. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kendra. It's very hard for me to follow that jingle at all, so I might say almost nothing at all. I mean, I love that story about the students getting that Exxon project denied planning permission. I think that just encapsulates everything you've just said about the type of story that we ought to be telling. It's a hopeful, empowering, inspiring story. So thank you for telling it, and apologies to everybody at home who's got that jingle stuck in their head.
It's on Spotify if you want to download it. Like, I'll send Adam a link. He can circulate it around.
I will actually do that. Okay, so we'll move straight on to Jacqueline then.
Great. And now I have to follow the jingle. I don't know how I'm going to do that, but so I'm a paleoecologist, and as a scientist, I have been asked, lots of questions by people around the world. And for a long time, the question I was asked the most is, what can I do? How can I help? And that's no longer the case. The number one question that I'm asked is there hope, or what gives you hope? And that's scary to me, because it feels very much like we have blown past the let's do something about the climate crisis straight to there's nothing we can do, it's too late. And so I'm really glad that we're having this panel discussion. And I'm going to share some of the things that have helped me as a scientist, kind of on the front lines of seeing the natural world, up close, but through many thousands of years of climate change and through into the present. Some of the things that give me hope, and it's going to be really quick, condensed into a really short period of time. So I don't mean to be pithy. But for me, I've sort of taken on the muskox as my climate resilience symbol. I even had a thread about being on Team Muskox, because for a while, we don't really use this framework anymore, but people talked about whether you were a climate hawk or a climate dove to reference, how urgent we should be approaching the climate crisis. And it's really interesting, in the last few years, as we started to see more climate impacts up close and personal, that framework has just fallen by the wayside. But I originally introduced this idea because I didn't like that binary. And my thinking was, I'm not a climate hawk, I'm not a climate dove, I'm a climate muskox. And muskox are incredibly stubborn. They power through the harsh Arctic winters through just sheer ruggedness and reserve. But they're also just, the more I learn about them, the more I realize that they are just this tremendous symbol of resiliency. When the mammoths and the woolly rhinos and the other ice age mega herbivores went extinct, somehow the muskox stuck around, right? They just toughened up and they stuck through these incredible climate swings that we've seen in the last couple million years on planet Earth. But they're also collective, right? As a species, they have a herd, but whenever they're threatened, the herd will sort of famously circle up around the young, the vulnerable, the sick, the elderly, and face sort of outwards to protect those on the inside of the circle. And they're also matriarchal, which I think is a nice symbol that reminds us about the power of climate justice frameworks and the need to get out of the sort of traditional patriarchal capitalist sort of structures that got us here in the first place. It's a reminder to me that the tools that got us into the climate crisis will not necessarily be the ones that get us out. And so I come back to the muskox over and over again. And they're also just stubborn, right? They just don't give up, even when things look rough. And so to me, when I start to feel despair, I just lean into my inner muskox. And so that's a useful, I think, framework. But there are some ways in which we can tie that down to some specific points that I think give me hope and hopefully will give you some as well. And the first of these is that we no longer need to fight climate denial. When I first started this work as a graduate student, speaking out about climate change in public, we were trained to convince people that climate change was real. That is no longer our problem, but what it means is that we need to be developing some new tools. But it also means that I can take some solace from the fact that concern for climate change is growing. This is data from the United States. We have incredibly fine-grained data from the Yale Program on Climate Communication. I hope we can all agree that the US has one of the more dysfunctional climate conversations in the world. And I'm sorry, I don't have data for Ireland. But just looking at the trend, even in the United States, with our incredible partisan divisiveness, we are seeing a growth in the numbers of people who are alarmed or concerned. And the so-called dismissives, the people who are what we might say denialists or climate cranks, that number has basically declined, or very recently in some of the most recent polls, it went up a notch, but it has occasionally dipped into the single digits. That gives me a tremendous amount of hope, because it means that they might be incredibly loud and obnoxious, especially on Twitter, but that they're not the majority, right? Even here in the United States. And so that means that we need to focus our energies, not on convincing others that climate change is real, but on mobilizing this incredible base of people that we have. And that base is largely driven in part by this immense youth movement that has arisen largely since 2018. And, according to the United Nations, we have 1.8 billion people on the planet right now between the ages of 10 and 24. And that's the largest youth generation in history. And young people are increasingly at the forefront of climate change activism. Something like 70% of people aged 16 to 25 are heavily concerned about climate change. So even more so than those numbers that I showed you before. And that's according to a recent study in The Lancet, that spanned 10 different countries. So this is, beyond just an American phenomenon. And they've been incredibly effective, I would say. Here in the United States, the Sunrise Movement has been a fantastic example. It's a youth-led organization that focuses on climate action and also integrates that with job creation. And that shows us that movements that link climate action with climate justice are not only critical, but they're highly effective. And so I think the important thing to remember is that when it comes to the climate youth movement, the youth don't just need our support. My generation largely failed to address this crisis until it was too late, right? We had the opportunity, and the generations that came before us, right? So I'm sort of either a geriatric millennial or a baby Gen X, depending on how you want to parse the lines. So we're sort of coming into our power, so to speak, inheriting this problem from the previous generations that also failed to do anything about this crisis. And the youth movement today has arguably been much more effective than any of our previous generations combined. So they don't just need us to cheer them on. They need us to amplify them, to support, to collaborate, to listen to them, and to lend our expertise and our efforts. So these movements are out there. They just need more bodies on the ground. I wanted to share one really nice example, I think, of how climate action and activists, we can learn from the past, and by looking at successful movements. One of my favorite examples of what I would call a climate win would be the hole in the ozone layer. So as a child growing up in the 80s and the 90s, climate change wasn't the big issue we heard about. It was deforestation, but it was also the hole in the ozone layer. And scientists had first warned us that certain chemicals could deplete atmospheric ozone, which protects us from the sun's harmful ultraviolet radiation, back in the 70s. So this was, this could happen. By 1985, scientists had confirmed that, yes, indeed, there is a hole over Antarctica. And that same year, world governments adopted the Vienna Convention for the Protection of the Ozone Layer. And this set the framework for the Montreal Protocol, which you might have heard of. And that was adopted in 1987, and it went into effect in 1989. And interestingly, it's the only UN treaty that was ratified by every country on Earth. And since then, to date, we've phased out 98% of ozone depleting substances. And as of this last year, the hole in the ozone layer is about halfway towards being healed, right? So we're seeing a reduction in the size of that hole. It takes decades, of course. We can't expect immediate results from any of these processes because of the residence time of these kinds of chemicals in the atmosphere, and also sort of the slow phase out of some of the alternatives to CFCs, like HFCs, which turned out to be worse. So there's always going to be some lag time between when we decide to act and when we actually act. And we're coming on, something like 40 years since this hole was first confirmed, but we're 50% of the way towards, a complete recovery. And so this is such a great example. I often hear people say, oh, you climate scientists, you keep going on about climate change and global warming. Whatever happened to that hole in the ozone layer? Well, what happened is that we actually did something about it. And we like to talk about the UN as sort of being the main lever that actually enabled this process to take or to go forward. But that process came about because of corporate leadership. So Dow Chemicals, read the room, and they realized that these chemicals were going to be faded out, so that they needed to actually put some effort into other methods. But also there was a tremendous global grassroots activist effort that led the way in terms of pressuring, the governments in their own individual countries to act on this issue. And so we had this sort of public-private, not really a partnership, but we had many, many different angles that were putting pressures on world governments, who then came together in the United Nations. This didn't just happen in a vacuum. And so I think examples like this, like the hole in the ozone layer, are a really fantastic example that we can look to and say that, yes, there are tools that we can use. We know they've been effective in the past, and they will work. And it might take decades, but we've saved millions of lives because of this action. And the reason that I call this a climate win is not just because it's a nice model for how collective action can be really powerful, but we have since learned that the substances that were banned as part of the Montreal Protocol are actually really strong greenhouse gases. And so by eliminating CFCs and HFCs and other chemicals from the atmosphere, we actually unintentionally prevented about 1.1 degrees Celsius of warming. Just internalize that for a second. Right now, it could be over a degree warmer than the one-ish degree of warming we've already had in the last century because of these chemicals. That is a tremendous amount of disastrous climate change that's been diverted thanks to this strong and swift action. So it could be a lot worse than it is now. Some other things. This figure doesn't even take that kind of action into account, but we often talk about various climate scenarios, different pathways. One of the things that I will say is that when you hear about these different climate pathways and scenarios for our future, so these are sort of the menu of potential futures, and we just were treated to an update by the IPCC on that just yesterday. The biggest uncertainty in those future projections is not the Earth system. There is some uncertainty in things like tipping points related to glaciers and permafrost, et cetera. But the single biggest uncertainty is people. It's what are we going to do? Are we going to share our technology? Will there be a global pandemic? These are the things that are really difficult to predict in these future emission scenarios, these pathways. A lot of ink has been spilled on one particular one called RCP 8.5. I don't have time to go into a lot of the details there, but this is from a really nice piece by Zeke Hausfather in the Washington Post, where he explains why RCP 8.5 is often described as the business as usual scenario, but it is actually the least likely scenario. And in fact, in the last few years, some of the worst case scenarios in terms of our potential climate futures have been eliminated, right? So have some of the best case scenarios, right? The least amount of warming possible since we started having these projections with the IPCC. But that means we're somewhere in the middle, right? And we have a lot of influence on just how much warming takes place or how much warming we're committed to over the coming decades. And as Adam said, every fraction of a degree matters. It saves millions of lives. And so not thinking about climate change as a sort of pass-fail is probably one of the best things that you can do for the planet. I'll come back to that. So one of the things I wanted to mention is this is from one of my favorite cartoons by XKCD. It's a web cartoon. It's very sciencey and nerdy, but he occasionally does a climate comic. And this one frames projected warming of 4 to 6 degrees Celsius based on the equivalent ice age warming that we saw. So this is how much the planet warmed as we came out of the last glaciation. And at the time that this comic was published in 2014, we were looking at something like 4 to 6 degrees Celsius warming by the end of the century. That was considered, very probable in terms of an outcome. That number has now been revised down to closer to 2.7 degrees, right? So this 8.5 RCP 8.5, this high emissions pathway or business as usual, as I mentioned, has been eliminated from our suite of possible futures. And that is because of some things that are really surprising that weren't predicted for when that pathway was described originally. So we've been phasing out coal much faster than expected, and we have been ramping up the adoption of green technology much faster than expected. So there is capacity for technological developments and social movements, et cetera, to move the lever on some of these emissions scenarios. And so to me, I get a lot of hope out of the fact that not even a decade ago, things looked worse than they do now, even though it doesn't always feel that way because of some things that we just could not imagine happening, even a decade ago. I wish I had more time to get into this because this is, really my bread and butter. But as a paleoecologist who studies how the Earth system has gotten through some of our worst times in the past, I take a lot of comfort from stories of resilience, right? If I could just ask you, if you're anywhere near a window, or if you have any houseplants or anything in your house, just take a moment, or the next time you go for a walk, look around you. Every single plant, animal, insect, bird, everything around you that you see is a survivor. It's a survivor of the incredible climatic upheavals of the last 2.5 million years. And in some cases even longer. And we are doing our best right now as a species to try to, undermine that resilience. But I take an incredible amount of comfort, and I learn, I think we can learn from the natural world in terms of how to get through this, because there are stories of loss, there are stories of extinction, but there are also incredible stories of survival and resilience out there as well. And the more you get to know the natural world, the more you spend time in it, the more you can start to see that. And to me, that not only reminds me of what I'm fighting for, but it also reminds me that I have a lot to learn from these ecosystems in terms of how we get through the challenges of the coming centuries. And so to close, this gets back at the point I made earlier. If I could just ask everyone, the one thing probably at this point that we can do that is the best thing we could do for the planet would be to reject binary thinking, to stop thinking of climate change as pass-fail, and start thinking of it as a continuum, a range of possible futures, and that everything that we do puts us on a pathway towards a better future. Every fraction of a degree matters, it's worth fighting for, and that will always be true. There's so much discourse right now about tipping points and points of no return and doomsday scenarios, as though climate change were sort of a door that once you pass through, there's no going back the other way. It's not a turnstile, right? We are always going to be needed, and our work will always have meaning, no matter what. And, if you stop thinking of climate change as pass-fail, that gives you so much more room to see the value of your own place in this movement. And so just some last parting thoughts about how to be a muskox when it comes to climate change. The first one is just to tell your climate story, find your community, talk about climate change, right? Talk about it with your neighbors, with your coworkers, with your family, make it part of your story, and bring other people into your climate story too. You don't have to know the science, you don't have to know the politics or the policies. You just have to know what you've experienced in your own life and why this matters to you. Personalize it. That makes it really powerful. And then you can bring other people into the herd, so to speak. The second thing is, we have a huge failure of imagination. We are really good as a society at imagining apocalyptic futures. Think about just how obsessed we are with zombie apocalypses right now. I just finished binge watching, The Last of Us as well. I get it. But try to find a book, try to find a piece of media that imagines a more positive climate future. It's really, really difficult to do that. There's a small genre called solar punk, but beyond that, most people don't even know that exists. And so there's a huge role that artists can play in this movement. We need to be able to imagine the futures that we want to head towards. And we can't do that if we keep telling stories about collapse and destruction and apocalypse, right? So those are really helpful in terms of warning us about possible outcomes. We need to be able to steer the ship towards something better. So we need those stories too. The muskox would tell you to emphasize collective actions over individual ones. Individual actions like changing your light bulbs are powerful because they help motivate further action. But the single biggest levers that we can really access as just members of the public are the collective actions. So getting involved in, registering people to vote, protesting, those kinds of actions over, the small day-to-day lifestyle changes that can sometimes make us feel better. But I think we all at this point know that that's not going to be enough. But that doesn't mean that they don't matter, because the more of us, the more we all do them, the more collective they become and the bigger changes we can make. Be stubborn, reject binary thinking, keep doing the work, even when it gets hard, even if it feels like it doesn't matter, because I promise you it does. And make sure you're centering climate justice, right? If we repeat the same harms of climate change with our climate solutions, what are we actually changing? Who are we doing this work for, right? And the frontline communities who have been dealing with the impacts of climate change the first and the most, right? Indigenous communities, members of the Global South, they don't have the luxury of giving up and retreating to a bunker somewhere, right? And if they're not giving up, then we shouldn't be either. So with that, I just want to thank you for your time, and I'm excited for this opportunity to talk with you all.
Great. Thanks very much, Jacqueline. So much to reflect on there, so much good stuff, particularly our work our collective work always being needed. So thank you for that. I'll move us straight on to Assad.
Thank you, Adam. Right, so I wrote a book called Saving the Planet Without the Bullshit. And the reason I did that is I have a 26-year-old who's my eldest, and I spent a lot of time with him and his friends over the years. And what I saw is quite clearly that generation, by and large, they want to do the right thing. But at the same time, what I saw is that very often there is a fog in terms of the information that they're digesting. And so it's actually not that clear to them that whatever it is that they're doing is the right thing from an environmental perspective. And the reason there is a fog is because just in 2022, so last year, 7 oil companies, by my count, made approximately $350 billion. That's $350 billion of profits in just that 1 year. You can imagine how much fog that kind of money buys. And then the thing about that fog is it's been feeding into the debate for 40 years. It's not new. And therefore, it's just confused everybody pretty much. And I wanted to just cut through that by going through someone's daily life, what we eat, what we breathe, how we travel, how we invest, and just draw a line between what matters and maybe what matters less, and is more in the category of virtue signaling or making one feel better, with the objective being, for people to know what climate action actually makes sense. And I did that coming at it from multiple perspectives, including the fact that during the day I run a renewable energy business in Asia. And in Asia, climate change isn't a concept and isn't far away. It's something that we see all around me all day long, effectively, in terms of its impact on people and communities. And to maybe distill what I was trying to say in that book, there's really 4 or 5, principal ways to act on climate that matter more, shall we say, than other ways to act on climate. So the first one, which people, in my experience, often forget about, is to make a difference at one's workplace. Because climate change isn't something that we just kind of focus on after work. It's really something that is everywhere. It's quite holistic as it is. And so we can't forget about it while we work. Now, you can be in a climate change facing business, say renewable energy, and that's fine, but most people aren't. And so for those who aren't, you can still take climate action wherever you are employed. It can be a law firm, it can be an insurance company, it can be a university, it can be a supermarket, it can be a hospital. And you can start with the basics, the cafeteria. Let's effect change in the cafeteria and then escalate. There's no reason why lawyers, for example, shouldn't be vetting new clients based on climate criteria and with a climate change lens. And 2 or 3 people in a business are actually a climate movement as well, right? So I often find that the impact of effecting change from the workplace is maybe not used much by very well-meaning people who are otherwise trying to act on climate. And I think it's a pity because this can be scaled, right? There are hundreds of millions of people that are working, and they can make a huge difference by changing corporations and governments from the inside as opposed to from the outside. So that's the first thing. The second thing is communicate, um, as referred to earlier. And that's shouting from the roofs, obviously, about climate change and climate action, with facts, and then some more facts to whoever would listen. And ideally, doing that relentlessly and close to daily, which is what I do with my social media feeds, for example, where I communicate literally daily, 365 days a year. Now, you can communicate in short form, so that would be social media, for example, as well as conversations with family, friends, and coworkers. And you can communicate in long form via podcasts or articles or books. When you communicate, it's very important, I think, to recognize that people don't want to just be depressed with climate news. And so, but it's also important to recognize that the distress related to climate impacts is actually widespread. So I have every Sunday a tweet, which is called Good Climate News This Week, which I send out in 240 characters, summarizing the good stuff that happened each week, and very much from a global basis. And then you can literally, I've been doing this for 3 years, and you can literally click on each tweet to see 5 or 6 great things that happened this week on a global basis again. And you can keep on clicking until you've had your fill with everything that's good that's happening in terms of climate action. I also have a podcast which is called The Angry Clean Energy Guy. It's basically a 20-minute monologue. And once a year, I do also publish an episode which is about the 10 best things that happened in climate in the previous year. And that's, again, trying to do the same thing, which is to motivate and inspire and actually show how much progress there's been, without forgetting about what that $350 billion of net profits by oil and gas companies can buy in terms of inaction, in terms of slowing action, and in terms of propaganda and effectively misleading information, of which there is an absolutely enormous amount out there. And I recently put out an episode discussing of the podcast discussing oil trolls, because I noticed on my social media feeds, that the number of trolls has just gone up significantly over the last year. And clearly, there is a correlation between how much money oil and gas companies are making and how many trolls are out on social media trying to effectively depress people and kill the debate and then spread misleading information. And the third thing one can do, which is pretty straightforward, is to back NGOs that are trying to make a difference in the space. There are plenty of them all around the world, and you can back them with time. You can back them really with any resources that you have. And that's why I serve on the board or as ambassador of NGOs, very much for that reason, to make sure that some of my time is allocated to that activity. Number 4 is protests. Protests are incredibly effective. And I really want to give you just a picture from perhaps an unexpected country about protests and what they have achieved. And that unexpected country is China. In China, there were thousands of protests, going up to 74,000 demonstrations and protests in 1 year, back in 2005, all of which were protests on environmental grounds. It was basically people pissed off about the fact that they did not have clean air, or they did not have clean water, or they had polluted rivers. And what they did is they just went out on the street and they protested. And yes, that was in China. And the government, after a decade of this, had no option but to respond. And the current Chinese president, Xi Jinping, all the way back in 2013, actually made a promise to build an ecological civilization. And then gradually this culminated in 2018 when he unveiled a super agency to deal with environmental issues in China. And then if you fast forward until today, they have in China trained 2,000 judges and prosecutors on environmental grounds to go after polluting companies specifically. And they drafted laws and regulations. And they have filed 80,000 lawsuits against polluters in China. So if protests can have such an impact in China, they can have perhaps an even bigger impact anywhere in the world. And I think protests are therefore something that it's very worthwhile to think about. And protests don't have to be what you might associate immediately with it being a protest. I mean, for example, if you stop buying a newspaper because that newspaper is full of climate misinformation, that is a form of protest as well. And so that's the fourth kind of takeaway that one can do. And then the fifth one, which is a bit more difficult and final one, is to find platforms, they can be communities or they can be businesses, that are actually allowing a very wide group of citizens to take climate action together. For example, against deforestation, or in the case of renewable energy, for example, driving more funding into renewable energy to basically accelerate it. And then on and on, there are many examples of these platforms, but you have to just keep your eyes on it. And anybody can start one of those as well. It doesn't actually involve capital, but it does involve time. And so between these five kind of takeaways, that I think cuts through the fog, because ultimately, as I argue in my book, individual actions like going vegan or flying less or even recycling, which is completely almost nonsensical since we have no recycling infrastructure and hardly anything is recycled on a global basis, are all perhaps good, and perhaps they make us feel better, but in the big scheme of things, they are things that don't move the needle. And so we have to just stay focused on what is it that moves the needle, and how do we collectively do something or enable a collective to actually act. And thank you very much for listening.
Brilliant. Thank you, Asad. Lots of really good stuff there. I hope everyone's taken notes about those 5 things that you can do in your everyday life. And also fascinating insight about China as well, because as some of you have already alluded to, lots of climate trolls on social media. The first thing a lot of people say is, why don't you go to China and protest? Well, sounds like quite a lot of people already are. Now, it's over to yourselves now, over to the audience. There's a Q&A function in the Zoom. You should be able to see it there. I can see people have already left comments, mostly praising our wonderful panelists, but feel free to put some questions in the chat for your panelists, and we'll just take them in bunches, and we'll do that until 1:30. So over to the audience for some questions. Well, while we're waiting on some questions, I think I might jump in with one on my own. I wonder whether you could actually unpack that a little bit, Asad, around the China angle, because that is particularly interesting to me. And we had a little bit of a discussion before we started this call, and you'd alluded to it. And I know it had been spoken about a little bit about. I heard a little bit about it in James Thornton's book, who's the founder of Client Earth. He has a book called Client Earth, which I think people should read. But could you maybe unpack some of that stuff that's happening in China and what the current state of the ecological civilization policy is, if you have that information?
Look, China today has many issues, but if you look at the climate side of things, there's no question that they've cleaned up their air. They're also number one in the deployment of solar and wind power globally by far. And these are the principal tools to actually try and do something about limiting warming. They're also number one in electric vehicles. They're number one in batteries, deployment and manufacturing. They're number one in manufacturing solar panels. They're number one in manufacturing wind turbines. I mean, they're number one in almost everything that has to do with kind of fueling lifestyles with clean energy. They're not alone, obviously. Western Europe and the United States are very large players of their own. However, the Chinese are certainly trying to pull their weight. And it's not just the Chinese. I mean, I should say, all of Asia is acutely aware of environmental problems because it's very personal, so to speak, and therefore doing something about it. But there's no question that China's efforts over a time, and what you hear often is, oh yeah, but they're still building a lot of coal, which is absolutely true. However, they're building a lot of coal because they're trying to effectively use an enormous amount of energy, and they have to plug some gaps while bending their emission curve, which has plateaued now actually in 2023, and we should therefore expect it to start going down. And I think if one looks at the data, there's no question that they are super serious about it.
Thanks, Asad. So I'm going to pick a couple of questions and then just offer them to all the panelists to respond. Question here from Annie Ward McLaughlin. Do you think there's one particular aspect that needs focusing on at present? I'm trying to choose a subject to write an ecology dissertation, but it's overwhelming how many areas need attention. I think we can all probably relate to that. So that's question number one. And I'll throw this other one as well from Gwen. Rather than inspiring people, many artists working in climate activism turn people off because they come across as morally superior and talking down to people. How can this be avoided? So over to any of our panelists to jump on those two.
Well, for the morally superior, the thing that I find is the most useful is humor. I think just humor in general, I kind of vaguely, for a while now, I've had a rule that as long as nobody's dying, you can make a joke out of it. And if you're doing something where people die, but the person you're talking to actually lived through it, if they want to crack a joke about it, like leave it in. That, especially in audio, that works really well. But I think humor is a way of getting around the moral superiority, and also recognize that we live our lives embedded in systems and we're all doing the best that we can. I rent, so my home is powered by oil. I have no say in that. I can be morally superior and move. I'm going to move for other reasons. But like, someone is still going to live in this unit, like me not consuming that isn't the solution. The solution is getting my landlady to not use gas or not use oil. Like, I think humor and also just recognizing that people are doing the best that they can are kind of the two way. Like, most people are doing the best that they can with limited information and limited resources are kind of the two big tranches. And also, like, I think the last is always make sure that you're punching up, right? So like, it's okay to make fun of Taylor Swift and her private jet, but like, do not make fun of like some dude with like a 40-year-old beater SUV because that's probably the only thing that he can afford, right? Like, these are different situations. They're not equal, right? So those are kind of big things. It's humor, recognizing everyone's doing the best that they can with limited resources, and always make sure that the object that you're punching up, not down.
Yeah, I would echo that. I think, coming back to the message, right? Coming back to what our goals are, being strategic. There are so many disciplines that work on climate that we can learn from. There's a whole communications literature that's out there. So I like to say that any hot take that you have about what works or doesn't work for messaging, or how you should talk to people or how you shouldn't talk to people, that's a testable hypothesis, and I guarantee someone's already tested it, right? There is already data. We know how to get people to change their behavior. We know that shame does not work very well at all. We know that one of the biggest predictors of whether someone will have solar panels on their house is whether their neighbor has it, right? So there's really good evidence out there about how to get people to change their behavior. People study this. They devote their careers to that component of climate change, just like I devote my career to understanding the natural world responses. And so I would encourage people to engage in some of that literature. And it's not even just in the sort of esoteric academic publishing world. There are whole books on climate communication and science communication in general that are very accessible and fun. I will try to drop some examples in the chat. Catherine Hayhoe, for example, is a fantastic, world-renowned expert on this topic, who I've learned so much from in terms of my own messaging. And so I would say, pay attention to the people who are really focusing on their message, watch what works, experiment in your own life and see, how do people respond? People respond much more to personal stories and than they do to facts, right? Statistics. It's deeply unsettling for me as a scientist and an educator. I teach in a university, to hear that stories and empathy are more effective at getting people to change their behavior than presenting them with data. But that's the world we live in, and that's what I have to work with. So I would just encourage you to, if you're really thinking about your messaging, shame doesn't work when it's your peers. Corporations, yeah, that's like Kendra mentioned, calling out bad actors who have a lot of power. That can be highly effective. Shame campaigns can work really well when you're punching up, but don't punch laterally. So.
Brilliant, thank you. And that has actually taken us to time. So yes, so probably a really good note to end on, actually, about punching up, actually, Jacqueline. So thank you. That was the last question we have time for. Thank you so much to our panel, and thank you to you for attending. I hope you leave tonight feeling more hopeful about the future, but also having been provided by our panel with some ways to actually take some action. To maybe echo with something that Jacqueline said, or to paraphrase something that Jacqueline said, that there's a wide range of possible futures out there. And one of my favorite musicians, Joe Strummer, once said that the future is unwritten. And after tonight's talk, I hope that you'll want to help write the best possible version of the future. So thank you very much for attending, and have a good evening. Thank you.